Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Rights and Wrongs, the podcast about rights, privileges, and misconceptions. Today is a roundtable on immigration. I am joined by Claudia Palacios and Carmen Cruz. I will have them introduce themselves. Would you like to go first, Claudia?
Well, my name is Claudia Palacios. I'm Colombian and I'm a single mom of two. My son is Simon, is 12, and my daughter is Emily, who's 9. I got a background in modern languages from my home country, from Los Andes University in Bogota, the capital city. And during my professional life, I gained extensive experience in teaching English as a second language, international education, hospitality, and entertainment. Right now, with this program that I'm studying, where I had the fortune to meet George and Carmen, I chose to have a transition in careers in human rights because it was opening me the opportunity to explore new dimensions of serving, of providing something good for people beyond local borders. Right now, uh, given my background and the little experience in human rights, I only had the interest. I am also working here in Scotland as a volunteer for the Scottish Refugee Centre, where I get to apply all the theory and like see all that theory in action, the theory of the program. And well, we live in a world that's moving and changing all the time. So I'm very happy to share my thoughts with you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carmen Cruz. I'm very excited to be here. I'm looking forward to our discussion today. I have a bachelor degree in social cultural anthropology from the University of Puerto Rico, and I'm currently doing a master in research on human rights and international politics at the University of Glasgow in the UK.
All right, perfect. My name's George. I'm from America. Got my bachelor's degree at Curry College in criminal justice with a minor in sociology. I also went to Massasoit Community. I am a former war vet with the Marines, so I kind of have a weird view when it comes to a lot of human rights, but they're my peers and these are my fellow students here at the University of Glasgow studying human rights and international politics. Now, before we had this meeting, I'd asked the two guests here to have a list of issues that they thought was most important when it came to immigration. All of us come from different backgrounds, and it's also really important to realize that coming from different backgrounds, we have different views and different priorities. Claudia, did you want to start with what you thought your the top issue in immigration is?
Yes, and now that last week we had the International Refugee Day, and that we have so many issues worldwide with immigration. And there are two important things. That one is stigmatization, that's mainly framed by our otherness, because we are quotation mark the different people, or immigrants are different people, and how that correlates to identity and the relationship we're going to have as migrants to the new culture, to the host culture. So there are important things about identity, stigmatization, and one very important thing is that there is not an international law per se. There is no such thing as an illegal immigrant. If you're leaving your country because your life and security for various reasons is threatened. And let's talk about like the first two things. Is that sometimes when we've heard that the countries have social disturbances, they have civil wars, they also have totalitarian systems in which they oblige and force people to migrate to leave the country. And my country, sadly, is one of those, or has been one of those. And people leaving, they have many different reasons, but when you are trying to protect yourself and you need to arrive to a safe place for yourself and in your family, once established and once arrived at the new place, you want to be visible. If you want to be visible, and probably when you first enter and you know that you are the different one, because everything is going to be different, you feel like you're invisible. So invisibility, it's like a very tricky concept that cultures use to deal with immigration.
Can you go more into what you mean by invisible, though? Because I find that
probably that we've been framed by that we understand that we need that discrimination is a quotation mark bad. We're not going to be open about it. But we see that many people are coming, and at the same time we hear on the news and we listen to our governments framing their various stories about, oh yes, we're receiving some people, they are coming to the country, but their communities are being framed of those concepts, and sometimes that creates fear. In that fear, wants like the host country or the host population to adapt the position of invisibility, because that's part of the protection from the other. As well, the migrant wants to feel invisible because he just wants to be there, right? And probably he's afraid of breaking the rules. He's also afraid because the person or the family doesn't have the language. So invisibility is a concept that
that's the reason I just find it really fascinating. You talk about invisibility, because I know we've talked about it before. Is coming from Massachusetts, like most of the undocumented workers, like there's no such thing as an illegal person, they're not from the Latin world. They're not from Southern America. Most of them are Europeans. Most of them are from Asia and stuff like that. But the strange thing about it, though, is because of the fact that they're European, they're white, especially being like a lot of them are Irish or Russian in Boston, or like where I come from. If you see someone walking around the streets of like any major city and they have a European accent, you just kind of don't think anything of it. They're like, it's like they're invisible by default. But like that's the reason. But then you have someone that could be of Spanish descent, and like that's the reason I just find the word invisible like such a strong, powerful. But it's also on like so many different levels. Like at one hand, you say you want to be invisible because you don't want to be noticed, but the other hand, like the government and the people want you to be invisible because they don't want you to have a voice. But like it's just that's really I was just asking if you could clarify more onto it, because it's just a fascinating term to use. I guess is the best word.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we are or we were obliged to be invisible, not to disrupt the other countries like status quo. But however, it has already been disrupted because we're there, right? The immigrant, the others are there, and we need to talk about it, and we need to talk about it like honestly. But what we're facing is that this ambiguous way of governments, and also sometimes supported by certain media, to generate fear and to start to construct stereotypes. Now that you mention it, because the way you look, so the way they speak, like Latinos, Latino migrants speak. So now people in the community start to make those connections. However, there's more to that, because there is cultural contribution. There's also social and artistic contribution, and that's how most of the time there's this process of integration that is very important. Now that a person, a group of a family knows for sure that is not going to go back to the country because it's the life needs to be protected. And well, as I was telling you, as per the UN Declaration on Refugees, the UNHCR, the convention declared in the protocol the status of refugees says that there's when the fear of threaten the life and the rights, the person needs to be protected. And that's how sometimes our countries decide not to use the word refugee, because that demands the country, the state, to protect the communities. And there are many different interests over there. So it starts like a political debate, discourse, and unfortunately, it's the people who need the most who are like isolated. And that's how invisibility is no longer the issue, because they are so visible that they need to be addressed to, but they need to be properly addressed with respect.
Carmen, did you have anything to add to that?
I'd like to start by giving a more historical perspective on the topic, specifically in Latin America region. It is important to ask ourselves why these people are coming to the United States, right? People don't decide to leave their country and their loved one just because. This is don't come out of nowhere. There is a story behind all of this. I think it's something that's missing from the conversation on the topic of immigration, and is one of the many variables over the topic. So I'm going to try to be as brief as possible because it's a lot of information. So what are the roots and causes for the immigration that we see from Latin America or Central America? To understand these immigration waves from Latin America, we have to understand the historical events. The relationship between the US and Latin America is long and complex. Basically, this relationship starts since the US became a nation. First, we have the Monroe Doctrine, was first introduced in 1823 by President James Monroe. So this doctrine became the United States' primary foreign policy to declare that the Western Hemisphere was closed from any type of European colonization or intervention in the region, right? So this deeply affect the United States foreign policy and relationship with Latin America countries. This doctrine helped to intervene with Spain and their colonies in Latin America. So we see this during the Spanish-American War. But the doctrine later became a justification for military intervention in the region, Central America. The Monroe Doctrine was created to protect the Americas from European colonizers, but it also served to the US best interest. The way in which the United States choose to intervene in Latin America, especially in Mexico, Cuba, Colombia, Guatemala, was greatly influenced by the benefits and interests of the nation at the time, right? So those interests were like land, economic prosperity, the United States ideologies. So after this, we see the banana wars, and this is a very important topic in inside the discussion, right? The Banana Wars was the occupation and intervention of the United States in Central America and the Caribbean between the end of the Spanish-American War. The U.S. motivation for these conflicts were largely economic and military. The U.S. wanted to preserve the commercial interests in the region, so they create a monopoly of plantations in the region. As we know, the land in Central America was very fertile, so many U.S. corporations moved and established business in the region. And these corporations were constantly protected by the army, right? So any attempt to work with the inequalities in the region, the US government will step in. So we see a lot of coups, interventions in the 1900s. The Banana War led to an occupation in Nicaragua for 20 years. This occupation came to an end during the Great Depression and the rebellion led by Augusto Calderón Sandino. And Sandino is also a very important person in this topic because Sandino was a revolutionary and many people still celebrating him to this day in Nicaragua. He was assassinated in the 1934 by the U.S. National Guard led by General Somoza. Somoza was a local in Nicaragua. He was a general. So Somoza ruled Nicaragua under a dictatorship for 40 years. And people in the region got tired of this, so they adopt the Sandino's revolutionary ideas. And this is one example of the many coups across Latin America that characterize the foreign policy of the US in the region since the early 20th century, right?
One thing that's also really fascinating about that too, though, is like, not to like cut you off, it's just all this is like really well-known documented history across Latin America, but we don't, like, I grew up in an American school system. We don't really hear about it. The weird fact about it was the first time I ever heard really about the Banana Wars was in my military education during boot camp for the Marine Corps history, because the Marines were the ones that were sent in. And the only thing you ever hear about these in the United States is what she's talking about when she says Banana Wars. If people aren't familiar with it, it's American businessmen would own big plantations. It would be pineapples, bananas, anything that's like we don't think is expensive now, but were very valuable back in the day. Yeah. They would get these plantations. They ran by businessmen. They basically treated the local populace almost as slave labor to run these plantations. But because they were business interests controlled, anytime that the people tried to like burn down the plantations because they didn't want the influence any there, they would call the Marine Corps in and they would basically quell the rebellion, which sometimes it would be armed citizenry, other times it would just be martial law in these areas, and these areas would be overthrown to the governments with coups, and the Americans would instill their own version of democracy, in which we call banana republics, which is strangely how we have the store name. Yeah. So like it's a huge part that like of how America shaped Latin America. But the only thing that you ever hear about it is from wartime history teachings in combat, like for combat schools or when you're shopping at a mall. And like that's really no, because your talk is really important. Just like many people probably don't know this.
And it certainly went all over the region, because there was a genocide case in the early 20s, in the 20s in Colombia. There was a genocide of plantation workers who wanted and demanded better job conditions and dignity for their families and dignity for their schedules, their work schedules. And they were assassinated. Yeah. They were assassinated. And that's part of our history. And it didn't stop over there. Like,
no, exactly.
20 years ago, there was this issue with Chiquita brands. They also had a plant in Colombia, and it it was certified, and it was proven that they had nexus with the paramilitary to protect the the factories, the
And
farms.
that's like the craziest thing that if you actually really look at, if you look at immigration purely through an American standpoint, like a lot of the times, and it's also really interesting because you can see the same parallels with the British, like here in the UK, is majority of the immigrants that come to the US are coming from places that were former colonies, for a better word, or occupied territories of the US. Like a lot of people forget that the United States, for lack of better words, stole Mexico, California, New Mexico from Mexico through hostile negotiations. We occupied Cuba. We still have a weird negotiation with Puerto Rico. We occupied Japan. We occupied large portions of China in Indochina, which we now call Vietnamese, Laos, Cambodia. We occupied and stole the Philippines from the Spanish or in the Spanish-American War, the same way we got Cuba. But now it's strange to think that these people at one point would have been considered American subjects and paying American taxes. But now we kind of turn our backs on them when they're trying to re-enter for like a better life, because for nearly centuries we're telling them, oh, we're going to build you up, we're going to build you up. Then we leave and tell them like, oh, America's great, you're Americans, you're paying taxes to us, come with us. And then we just kind of slam the door behind us. And you can see similar issues with former British colonies here in the UK of people trying to enter the UK, which
Yeah. During the 1930s, we see that Franklin D. Roosevelt implement the good neighbor policy. This policy main principle was the non-intervention and non-interference in the domestic affairs and politics of Latin America. But, like the government in the region were very skeptical. And after this, we enter the 40s, we see the Second World War. In this time, we also see the intervention in Panama and Guatemala. During the 50s, we see another coup in Guatemala to the government of Jacobo Arbenz with the support of the CIA and the United Fruit Company. And this company also played an important role in all this. This corporation traded tropical fruits, like you said, that were grown in Latin America and plantations and sold in the United States and Europe. And after this, we entered the Cold War. The Cold War exploded. Many revolutions and left movement arose in Latin America. In particular, the Cuban Revolution made USA to think that there could be political powers like the Soviet Union getting involved in the region, right? All of this reinforced the US intervention in Central America and Latin America in general. In Guatemala, we see a 35-year civil war between the left movement and the US military. The CIA provide training, weapons, and intelligence to the Guatemala government to fight communists at all costs. This war claimed over 200,000 lives. The majority were indigenous Mayan people that were accused of being communists, right? So the US trained soldiers with torture tactics to create fear throughout this population. And for the first time, we see a mass immigration to the US after this event. Also in the 80s, we see the Contra War between rebels and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and El Salvador. We see that the Ronald Reagan administration support with weapons and training government forces to roll back the left wing in El Salvador and Nicaragua. And these tactics were made to prevent communists to spread in the world. The US government basically armed one side of the civilians to fight communists. That was the US goal. And again, in this process, many people die and people lost everything. We can see a report of the Truth Commission of the United Nations that talk about all of these events. Also in Honduras, we see a military base that attacked the Sandinistas. So all this instability and intervention in the 80s in Central America devastated the region. Obviously, with all of this, we see a social, economic, and political breakdown. This region still feeling the effects of this war. Also, in the 80s, LA were the center point of the immigration, right? So LA received around 17,000 immigrants. The US government didn't have a policy for this. So many of these people tried to apply for asylum, but the applications were denied. So we see a lot of undocumented people working 3 to 4 jobs to eat, to survive. So we see as a consequence that gangs in LA arose like the MS-13 during this time. We see under the Clinton administration the illegal immigration reform and immigrant responsibility act. After this, we can see mass incarcerations and deportation of members of these gangs. So the US sent these people to El Salvador. Many of them grew here in the United States, and they didn't know Spanish or even the country. So El Salvador government didn't have any policy to work with these people. And as a consequence, we see a mass increase in violence in the region. So the region had not even recovered from the civil war, and they have to receive gang members. So we see that they took power in the country. We see a fight for power between them and the government. After all this, the US government didn't stop the intervention in the region. The most recently military coup was in 2009. The past administration announced major aid cuts in the region. So the result of this was a military coup in the country. We see again violence, instability, and the removal of a democratically elected president in Honduras, Manuel Zelaya, and he was from the left wing. So in this fight, we see figures like the human rights defender and activist Berta Cáceres fighting against the coup. Years later, we see the assassination of Berta Cáceres. So we see almost 200 years of political, social, and economic intervention and instability in the area, right? So, in my opinion, the U.S. government have a moral and humanitarian responsibility after all these interventions in the politics of the region. The current public policy, like the wall, is not the solution. We're not dealing with the roots and causes of immigration. The effort to remove DACA and cutting aid from the region is also not the solution. The government can provide tools for the stabilization of the region. People are desperate. These families don't want to see their children's future fall into the hands of gangs. So people will continue to come. They don't really have a choice. So it's very important to understand the role that the United States have in this immigration wave, because only if we understand the problem at its source can we then begin to resolve it and talk more deeply about it.
Well, another thing that I think is really important to acknowledge is it's really true that when people are leaving these countries because they're war torn and they're having problems, in the middle of civil war, everything's falling apart. And one thing you'll see a lot, like not just on Fox News, but other like Republican sources, and you see it in many countries that deal with immigration like this. Like you always get that image where, like, I remember when the Syrian war was first kicking off, like the Syrian civil war was probably like 2014, 2015, you kept seeing images of what you'd always hear is fighting age men. Like all these immigrants are fighting age men. And like a lot of the feelings that we're getting in like America, because like I was sitting around with a bunch of other fellow vets and stuff, and then they're thinking like, well, why, if their problems are so bad, why aren't they just staying home and fighting? Why aren't they like, you're fighting age men? Send your women, send your daughters, send the elderly, send them. Like those are refugees. Like men should stay home and fix the issue. One that's got sexist undertones, but the second thing is people don't realize if you're coming from Syria or you're coming from Latin America, and the way that people, if they're so desperate to leave and they're getting denied this asylum, they're being denied anything, the routes they have to take and like the people you have to deal with isn't something that a young child can survive. Like, yeah, you have hundreds of children on the southern border of the United States that those kids had to endure hell to get there. And that's not downplaying it at all. But like people, like you also have to understand, like the people they are sending is they're usually sending their young men because they're more likely to survive. They're more likely to get a job. They can get themselves settled here in the States and then move on. Like one of the easiest ways to get, I don't want to say easy because it's not easy at all, but one of the fastest ways to get a US citizenship, strangely, is to join the US military. They will cut down your nationalization to a year, maybe a little bit more, but it cuts down a ton. And you can get your entire family, well, large portions of your immediate family or your atomic family involved in that. And that's why they'll send people forward like that. They're trying to get them a job so they can get a visa. And I just wanted to like to, because everything you're saying is really true and it's true and important, but I feel like what the truth of the story is, and then what hits front page news and what people see when they watch Facebook are polar opposites of each other, when in truth, they're just the same, they're different sides of the same face. And it's how people are leaving trying to leave the situation, of what they're trying to leave, and then the motivation, the modes that they try to come here. Because most people would take legal routes to the US if they could. It's just the United States is not an easy place to get asylum or migration. And then you also have the issues of what do you do when your country is in a civil war and now you're in statelessness? Like there was that amazing movie from years ago called The Terminal, where the guy's nation was in a civil war, so the US did not recognize your passport. But what do you do at that point when you are no longer from a country? These are questions people don't talk about. But was that what your main point was going to be, Cameron, or were you just adding on to Claudia?
I would like to add
okay, sorry.
With regards to that, because there is the international law and for example, the declaration with regards to refugees has nuances and has these ambiguities that our governments take. And in such a powerful country like the US, the UK, setting a stand, other countries are going to emulate. Other countries are emulating closing the borders and like telling, oh, no, that's their problem, not ours. And however, there are other countries, like in the case of South America, where I'm from Colombia, where with the Venezuelan diaspora, Colombia has not closed well, let's get the parenthesis before the pandemic, but Colombia never closed the borders, nor did Brazil. But other neighboring countries, were like the same, we're in the same region. We have trade agreements together, like Ecuador and Peru. They are closing the borders. Obviously, they claim that they need to protect the population because their economies, according to them, and it's not, they are not that strong to cope with such a huge flow of migrants. However, I would say that the problem is not only that the United States closes the borders or has this issues, that the other countries are emulating the same practices.
Yeah, a perfect example is after 9/11, US and Canada used to have relatively open borders. You didn't have to have a passport, you just had to show a driver's license. I remember I used to go to Canada all the time with my parents when I was a kid because you didn't need a passport. We would just go up there on vacation. Like we'd have passports on us just for like thing, but like all my dad would do is show his driver's license. Mom showed his driver's license. Me and my sister were kids, so go up. But after 9/11, the United States closed their borders. And then soon after, Canada did the same thing. I think it was a similar arrangement with Mexico, where you could just show your driver's license and cross the border. And it was a knee-jerk reaction to a terrorist attack. But it had long-standing resemblance. Like 9/11 was nearly 20 years from ago now. Like we're coming up on the 20th anniversary now, and we still haven't really leaned up our borders. Like, yeah, as Americans and Mexicans and Canadians get a different kind of ID that looks like a driver's license. Like I have one of those, but still we haven't reopened our borders, and it's only created more suspicion and more issues, like the Muslim ban that was put under our current American administration, which was just, you're trying to ban people from an entire country just because you think they might potentially, it was, there's such a strange way that we decide who can and who cannot enter a country based off entry points.
Again, that's my argument of the construct of the other people, the other, and how that's, I'm going to frame, I need to pick my people from the other. And with time, that becomes a political discourse, and that permeates the whole society that's happening in Colombia. Venezuelan, there are some wealthy Venezuelan, they had the fortune to go, like, not only, but some of them established in Colombia. They have very well established companies, drugstores, and they generate employment. There are some others who went to the United States, came to Europe, but it is the people, like the less privileged, were now struggling and getting stuck in the borders. And it's a border that there are like 7 official places or immigration points, but the frontiers, the border is so huge, they find the way to cross, and that can create, and that creates what we like mistakenly call illegal. It's because you don't do the paperwork to say that where you're coming from. But many of them just run away. And however, I would like to highlight that as long as we know that there is international law for protection to all human beings, and that we are all entitled, for being human, to specific rights. And obviously our governments have their own constitutions to protect the territory. However, there are also groups and grassroots movements who are getting hands-on in protecting the less privileged and trying to integrate them in whatever the way they want to, they need. For example, there are others, probably Colombia is like a path to the US or other countries. So there are communities, religious communities, grassroots NGOs giving care to them. And I think that is one of the ways to address that, is to address migration, is to determine if people want to stay. It is an opportunity for a country to receive migrants. Obviously, it is not going to be easy. It demands strengthening the public policies. And for example, in our case in Colombia, our public policies needed to be strengthened, and we were just coming out of the peace process, and then we received the huge wave of migration. But with support, with international and grassroots support, I believe that it not only in South America, but everywhere, like there is the possibility to address this issue in a more humane way.
And you bring up a really good point too about the whole entire, like the more common term to replace illegal, because you can't be illegal as a person. Like that's, to be a person, be a crime that defeats every single thing of human rights you could ever think of. But undocumented is really true. And a lot of people, I don't think, understand what undocumented truly means. It doesn't mean that you didn't come in there with documentation. Because I am a current immigrant in the UK at the moment. Like, I'm on a student visa. I have my documents. I'm a documented immigrant. If I overstay my visa and I don't extend it, and I just decide I'm going to stay past my visa, granted, my visa extends again, I think, because I'm an American, but like if I stay past that part, I am therefore an illegal immigrant in the UK or an undocumented immigrant. And that's how most people have. Most people that are in the United States, when you hear people talking about undocumented, it doesn't mean that they didn't show up documented. Like, we're talking a lot about these border crossings. We're talking about like more of the extreme cases, like the ones people want to focus on in the news because it gets news views and gets votes. But you can quickly become undocumented very fast. In the rare case that like your government no longer exists because of a coup or a rebellion, that your documentation says, let's look back in like history. How many times have we had countries like the Ottoman Empire fell and broke up into 20 other smaller nations? If your passport said Ottoman Empire and you were in another country, the Ottoman Empire doesn't exist anymore, you're undocumented. And like this stuff can happen in a second without people realizing. And we need better terminology, which is out there, but needs to get out there more understood. And we also have to, the laws have to keep up. Because as you spoke, we have international laws, but the international laws don't always pick up with the national laws. Like in the US, if you go to immigration court, you do not have a right to an attorney. Like, you can hire one, they're not going to stop you from that, but you're not issued one if you can't afford one, because that's a civil liberty or a civil right that only American citizens get, or extended cases of criminal court cases, undocumented can get it. But in that case, it's like, oh, this isn't a criminal court. You're not an American citizen. If you were an American citizen, you wouldn't be here. Therefore, you don't have the right to an attorney, so we won't supply you one, which just shows the injustice that they're trying to say that you are a crime, but you're not in criminal court, but you're being treated as such, but you don't even have the same rights as other humans. And these are the inequality of like the law when it comes to immigration that needs to be addressed. Sorry, Carmen, you're about to say something?
Yeah, to add to Claudia's point, you don't see the elites of Latin America in the border. You see people that are struggling in economically and in many ways. So also the elites in Latin America had contributed a lot in the inequality and social breakdown in the region. And to answer your past question, George, yes, that was my main point. I wanted to shed light on the source, right? I think that is how we can understand and solve this whole immigration topic, right?
Oh, that's true. I feel like I'm not a perfect expert when it comes to the UK version of the subject, but it seems to be the same thing here. Where in the UK, from talking to people that are immigrants, most of them come from former colonies of the UK. Technically, I'm from a former colony of Great Britain. And it's strange how you have to jump through hoops to go back to a nation that once claimed you, even though the reason you're leaving your former colony is because the country you're trying to go to is part of the reason why it's not in the greatest condition.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, yeah.
I think there's very few nations that have been colonized that were left in better condition than the colonizers arrived in. If you want to look at, depending on how you're measuring it and how you measure progress. Did you have another case that you wanted to bring up, Claudia?
Well, I just wanted to, I'm not sure how to share a clip from one of our regions in Colombia, where
I can link it to the bottom of like the podcast, like when I distribute it, or if you want
Perfect.
to, yeah.
Like, but is it going to be afterwards?
Yeah, or you could press share right now. If you see the share button at the below, you could do that as well.
But is it like in Twitch or here via Zoom?
Yeah, it'll be on Zoom.
Okay. Okay, so these are the things and that you might find interesting, and how youth right now is looking, and how identity and how our roots are so important when facing difficult times. And I'm going to share information with you, not only from Colombia and Venezuela, but from one of the students, a postgraduate student from the University of Glasgow, who is an Eritrean refugee, and who also gave his testimony during the session that was held last Thursday. So let me
Yeah, I can share that on that. If anyone can see on the screen, these are articles. I will add them to the end of the product. I can also set them into the Twitch screen. But yeah, I will add those later. Now, we're coming up close to the time. I was going to ask if you guys wanted to answer a few questions from the audience that's watching on Twitch on live with us right now, because I'm sure they have multiple questions. We've kind of bounced around a lot. But before we do that, this was a very unguided discussion. I will be honest, when I asked Carmen and Claudia here, I also asked my friend Kim to join us, but she wasn't able to make it due to scheduling issues, to bring multiple things, because I didn't know where this discussion was going to go when I asked for it, but it's because of issues like immigration are so huge. They're international, they're domestic. I know more about US immigration, but that's just because I study criminal justice in the United States. Immigration is a huge issue when it comes to criminal justice, even though it shouldn't be as much. But that's where I focus on, and that's where our politics fall. Studying here in the UK, I've realized it's a lot more of an international issue. You have to focus on that. Like, these two lovely ladies both pointed out the very international issues with it and how borders and how everything goes about it. And I just wanted to show that you can have people come from different views, different backgrounds, and have conversations. Because when you talk about anything in politics, where we have the huge issues of Black Lives Matters going on right now with the police killings in the United States, you're even seeing there's trying to be reform here in Europe. There's reform everywhere. You have human rights workers disappearing in Thailand. You still have the protests going on in Hong Kong. You have tragedies all around the world, and you're going to have a bunch of different views depending on who you talk to. And you could still learn from listening. You can still sit down and talk. You don't know where the discussion's going to go. You don't have to be the world's pristine expert on these subjects to produce. Like, you just sit down and listen and try and get the platforms out there. One thing I will be adding when this goes live, if you're watching from YouTube or watching from BeanPod, Carmen from our class, along with other students from our class, put together an amazing thing on Black Lives Matter, which I'll add. I'll put other articles that pertain to such the ones that Claudia's added when it comes to immigration. But just know to educate yourself and learn. And there are more than one perspective in every subject. And there is no, I don't want to say there's no wrong way to educate yourself in subjects, but there is no just one right way to educate yourself on a subject. And I just wanted to make sure people knew, like, that's the reason I wanted to have this. This is a very unusual way to do a podcast, and I understand that. But I also wanted to thank you guys for coming on and sharing so much stuff that I never even knew. So I just want to say thanks.
Well, thank you, George. This is like the first time that I'm live in this topic, in this issue, and I'm very proud of what you have done. And congratulations, and thank you so much for inviting me. And yes, I am open to any question that the audience might have.
Yeah, thank you, George, for having us, and I really enjoy it. It was also my first podcast, so I really enjoyed it. It was very excited, and I learned a lot.
So Abe Drayton asked, I hear about them in the leftist anti-colonial discourse about enforcement of global capitalism in the mainstream discourse. The only references are Banana Republic, as George mentioned, and the Woody Allen movie called Bananas. So I think he was asking if there's any other like places that in like mainstream that you can actually talk about like the enforcement of global capitalism like in mainstream if like people are trying to educate themselves. If you guys know any better.
Like to share a reference where they can learn about it?
Yeah, like that, like a movie. Like the one thing I would say personally, most of my knowledge on the subject strangely comes from Marine Corps history because we study about that, but that's coming from the more enforcement side of the argument, which is still something interesting to learn. And I feel like you need to have a balanced approach when reading about.
Well, I'm thinking about right now one of our literature Nobel Prize, Garcia Marquez, who talked about the genocide in the Bananeras. And well, I'm going to look for in also well, the historical link for reference where people can take a look at. It was a major fact in our history, and in fact, it shaped our nation history for good. And yeah, well, I'll have to look for the link, and probably afterwards, will it work to send the link over?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Or,
that'd be perfect. I can send that then.
I'm thinking we have a lot of information, and maybe one of the topics can be the Operation Condor in Latin America. You can Google all of this, like the Operation Condor, the Banana Wars, the Cuban Revolution. It's so many information.
Okay, let's see if we got anything else for questions. Oh, it says, so I had another question. It seems to me that one of the effects of the intense immigration restrictions in the United States is that it helps keep the general non-immigration population from hearing firsthand accounts of the effects of American foreign policy on other countries. Is there any evidence of that's deliberate? Keep the immigration out so it can't tell the people of what we're doing to them.
Can you repeat the question?
I think basically what the question was, it's true. One of the main reasons, like he was wondering if like it's coming from the question, like, do you think like one of the reasons that we keep immigrants out is deliberate because of the fact of like exploitation of like economic factors, talking about issues like the banana wars or how we conquer people that claim we go to Iraq and like these nations for oil, or we don't want people over, like we don't want people from India coming to the United States or anywhere because we don't want to talk about how we're exploiting them in their factories because they don't want like the voters to find out. I think that's the question he's asking. I wasn't sure if you guys have any opinions on this.
It's possible, and for answer this more deeply, we have to talk about all these civil wars and interventions to conclude about these kind of questions, right?
Yeah, it's true. Like that's the only thing about immigration. It's like it sounds like when you sit down and you ask a person, and like this thing I find very fascinating about immigration, it sounds like it's a one word. So like, oh, it must have a very simple one way back and forth conversation, but it doesn't. And like that's the thing about it. Like it was even strange to think about when you're talking about immigration is like when people think about, well, what is an immigrant? And like it's really strange if you ask most people when you think of what is an immigrant, like they'll have an image pop in their head. It took me like till last week to realize that I'm an immigrant. I never thought of myself as one because like I'm an American. It's like, yeah, I had to go to immigration. I had to do like get my fingerprint scanned, but I had to do that for other things. I had to go get like a visa, but like I just never thought of it. I was like, I'm a guest of a country. But I think that's also just because like that's privilege on my side. And like I never really been treated as in like I never feel like I've gotten like any negative treatment here in the UK, and I think that's a lot based of that. And like I like that's the whole thing. This is a really big conversation.
Yeah, yeah, and it's important to educate ourselves on the concepts of immigration, like you said. Like maybe you don't see yourself like an immigrant, but maybe you are. So it's important to educate ourselves in the topic because it's too much information. We have to understand the definitions, the perspective of of um, other persons, and I don't know how to educate people in general. Like George, what do you think? How can we educate people in the U.S. based on your life and experiences?
Well, that's like the whole other strange thing about it. Is like I was looking back on my experiences, and like I know I have like a very different view than most people, and like everyone remembers education different. Like the first thing you learn studying law enforcement is the worst person to ask for a recap is a person. We have the worst memories that we block things out and bring things in. But like I really don't remember going much over Latin America studying. Like I thought myself as a history buff and a history nerd, but like in the US we focus mainly on the wars. Like we're American Revolution, War of 1812, skip around something about the Texas Revolution, Spanish, like then we go to like Civil War, Spanish American War gets brushed over, Civil War, World War One, World War Two, smattering of Korea, and like that's your history lessons. If you learn that, like you also learn about like the signing of the Constitution and these are the rights and the like the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th Amendment that got rid of slavery and made everyone equal. And like I grew up in a very white area, so like most of my education when I was growing up in the area, it's like, oh, we're all immigrants. Like everything's fine. Like you're Irish, you're German. Like we're all immigrants, and racism's dead. It doesn't exist. But like I was around a bunch of other European people that were white. So like, and as when I growing up when I was younger, like until I hit middle school or stuff, I actually dealt with people from other races and cultures that I realized, oh, this isn't it, but you're still founded. So I think we need to like address this just every day, like just have people talk and communicate and just make sure people are aware of their surroundings and allow themselves to listen to the other side and all this other. And it's a complicated question too, because I don't think there's a single group of people that came to America that had it easy. When you look at the people that first came, like on the first landed and tried to build a settlement, like that wasn't easy. But then like when the next group of German immigrants came over, they were treated poorly. And then you look at like the Irish that came over, they were treated poorly. The Italians, they were treated poorly. The slaves were brought here against their will and treated poorly, and their descendants are still treated poorly. And it's like now you're just dealing with the next wave of immigrants, and it just shows we don't talk about American culture too much about how when people want to get in, my dad used this really good reference. He says people want to come into America, build a door, and lock it behind them. And every wave of immigrants thus far in our history has done this, and it's so stuck in American culture that I think we just need to address it. We need to tear down these doors, and we need to like, yes, we are immigrants, let other people in, but also understand that it's a really big, complicated situation that like most people, no one wants to come into a country illegally. No one wants to suffer through the things that they have to suffer. And no one wants to have like potentially running from the police and have ICE kick down their door. And that's where I find it strange in America, like where a lot of these things that people think that it's like a choice, whereas your choice is death or horrible living or a chance of a proper life, but treated poorly in another country. Like the choice is kind of made for you. And I don't think a lot of people talk about that. I could be completely wrong. Claudia, you look like you had something to say.
Yes, it's
So,
about the banana massacre. I shared with you two references. One's, well, the most common is from Wikipedia. The other one is an article from the New York Times. And the last one is the lawsuit held in, if I'm not mistaken, in the Indian American Human Rights Court, where Nikita Brands got the lawsuit and how it was, and how they closed the plant, and the news was framed not to talk about the reparation that was due and how it was negotiated.
yeah, never even, I never knew about
Never
that.
heard that?
No.
Well, that happens. We are framed in our education. We're framed by our governments as well.
Well,
So there is the sense of importance that also appears in media, in the news. So everything happening all around the world is important. So depending on how important it is for your country, it's going to be displayed. So
yeah,
that's a part of the reflection in like connecting with the idea and how do you educate yourself is always like the same exercise we're doing here in the program, like to see the different sides of the story, what each person needs to say, and what really happened.
and like that's the truth of it. It's like you can't really trust. I hate to say it, but you can't trust the media nowadays, and you can't trust like all sources. Like all of us are still working on papers for school, and like I'm guaranteed like all of us have come across one paper that says one thing, and it's like, oh, this is an academic article and it sounds so great, like this guy knows what he's talking about, he has a PhD. Then you find another article written like at the same time by another person about another thing, and like, oh, they're saying the exact opposite, but look at all this. And it's just like they both can't, like it's strange because they, in one sense they both can't be right, but in another senses they both can be right. And that's the problem when it comes to these issues. But when it comes to politics, where you have to make a decision, like you have to have a decision, you're never going to have the correct one. But it's really strange when you're dealing with situations with immigration where simple decisions from our past and simple laws cause so much issue, whether or not they mean to be good or not. Like the just soulless law. Like we had President Trump talking about how America's the only country to have birthright citizenship. Well, that's wrong. Every country in the world has birthright citizenship. There's just different versions of it. America uses common law version of just solus, means you're born in the country, you're now a citizen. But in America, we're the only people that have unconditional just solus. But it's also the same in Colombia, the same in Mexico, same in Canada, same all across the Americas has just solus. And you have it here in the UK, you have it in France and Germany, there's conditional. Like you have to be in the country for so long before your kid is born. But that's the crazy thing is like you'll have world leaders such as Trump make these statements. Oh, it must be true, but it's not. But and the thing about me is like I've always known birthright citizenship, and I always thought it was just solus, and just solus and birthright citizenship are two total different worlds. So like that's a huge thing. Also, I think people need to know is like learn to define terms, because like when you're talking about invisibility, if you talk about invisibility, I find it fascinating because I know exactly what you're talking about. Like you're talking about legal invisibility or people not seeing them on that. But like most people, it's like, oh, I can see an immigrant. But the fact that you can see it, like one that's showing our president, like our, what's it, our
Yeah, you can see there are different different perspectives of seeing the other person. So it is visible when it is important to talk about them, to frame them, because they mean something negative.
Yeah.
So at that moment they're not, well, they are visible. but they are invisible when they are, for example, and they are not paying much attention when they contribute to the economy, when they contribute to gastronomy, for example, when they contribute to culture. So, eh, as many of the issues that we've been studying, there is this fine line of ambiguity.
Well, that's the truth. Is like one thing I always find fascinating, especially more I study politics and more we've learned in this program here, is there is no such thing as a single standing issue. Because you think about like immigration, like, oh, it's a single standing issue. Well, it also feeds into economics because depending on whatever country you're in, most undocumented immigrants pay their taxes. They're never getting anything back from it because they have no social security number or anything like that to claim their rights for their taxes. But in one way or another, they're paying. Like they're buying groceries, they're paying taxes on that. They're working a job, even if it's under the table. All that work that the employer's doing, he has to pay taxes on that work. And like they own a car, you're paying taxes. You buy gas, you're paying taxes. And the strange thing is like a lot of people think like, oh, let's get like there's a great movie that was like a documentary. It was kind of like a joke documentary, but it was kind of still true. It's like A Day Without Mexicans, I believe what it was. And it's like, what if every undocumented worker left the United States? The nation would fall apart, like overnight, because even talking to my dad who grew up in Vermont, there's a bunch of apple farms around there. The people that were picking the apples weren't American citizens. They were undocumented from Canada or Mexico or anywhere else. And it's the food that comes to your table. There's a good chance that someone that's undocumented or even possibly stateless had their hands somewhat in that for like that. Like the people collecting welfare, good chance like a large portion of your welfare, that the money that you're taking is coming from people that don't even have the right to have welfare, which are things that are never spoken about.
Yeah, and to add to the point of taxes, like many people think that because this person don't have documents, they don't have social security, they don't pay taxes. No, undocumented people, they try to pay taxes, but they use the individual tax identification number to pay those taxes. So with documents or not documents, people are paying taxes.
That's where it's like interesting where people think like they're not paying and they're stealing from us. It's like they're not stealing. And if anything, we want to go where you always hear people saying tax is theft. Well, at least most of people that are nationalized or documented immigrants and stuff, we're at least getting part of our taxes back. The people that are undocumented are getting nothing about it. So if you want to talk about taxes theft, like taxes theft to the undocumented, not, and like it's we're the ones stealing. We're the ones that are getting the jobs. Like we're getting everything back from it. But we're running out of time. Do you guys have any closing thoughts?
Well, no, not really.
All right. Anything from you, Carmen? Any closing thoughts?
It is important to educate ourselves. It is important to understand the historical context and have a historical perspective in all these topics and issues, because if you understand history, you can understand why and why people are coming, why people are making these decisions. So it's very important to educate ourselves and to make our mind learning and reading. And so yeah, educate yourself and go more deeply in the topic, because it's really important to know the roots and the context of this kind of topics.
Yeah, I can't agree more. The best thing I'd say whenever it comes to a subject like this, break your bubble. like, I don't know like a better way to say that, but break your bubble. It's interesting because you're not, whoever you come across, you're always going to find equal footing. And it's important to establish the equal footing, but also understand where you don't have equal footing. Where like me and Carmen are both American citizens. She's lived in major US cities and all that stuff. Me and Claudia are both immigrants to the UK at the moment. We have equal footing there. Like, we're equal. All three of us are studying the same subject. You're always going to be able to find equal footing, but sit down and talk to people and figure out where you're different. And just because you disagree with them or you don't understand something or you doesn't mean you can't still have a valuable conversation about it, or you can't learn something from it. And that's what Roundtable is really to show. And I hope people learned a lot about immigration. I definitely learned a lot about immigration. I wanted to thank you again, Claudia, and thank you again, Carmen, for coming on. If anyone has any questions or you want to learn more, this episode will be recorded for audio only on BeatPod. I will have a video version of it up on YouTube. If you want to contact me right through rightsandwrongspodcast@gmail.com. If you want to have any discussions or disagreements, let me know. Or if you want to come on for a different issue, I'd be love to have you. Usually we do an interview system, but if you want to do a roundtable, have people, be glad to have you. So thank you.
Thank you, George. Thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you, Claudia.